welcome to our Bible Ponder this week. Today we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 7 after last 2 weeks splitting Luke chapter 6 into two parts. There's one section in particular that I will read and we'll talk about maybe in a bit more depth, but we'll go through the whole chapter and talk about it as we move through it. If you want to catch up on previous videos in our Luke series, you can find those on Facebook or YouTube, or some other videos that have led up to our Luke series looking at the ancient world that Jesus is born into. You can find those with the Dead Sea Scrolls and First Maccabees and a few others from previous times. So Luke chapter 7 comes just after the Sermon on the Plain, or Luke's almost version of the Sermon on the Mount, this first big chunk of Jesus's teaching that is emblematic of things that Jesus said and that Jesus taught. And so Luke gives that to us here near the beginning of his ministry that sets us up for what he's going to do as we go. One of the things we've also talked about previously in our Luke series is the idea that the stories about miracles and the healings and the exorcisms and things like that are not about the thing itself. They're not just stories to be like, hey, this happened. They're not also about any idea of God or God through Jesus coming to fix things or people to make them just whole and able-bodied, and that somehow to be not able-bodied is to be made wrongly or deformed or something like that. And then that's often been an interpretation in the past that Jesus is sort of fixing people, and that's not necessarily true, and that's certainly not true of all people with disabilities, and that's not how they would see their disabilities. And so these stories are not about Jesus or God somehow doing these things. And then the question is, why don't they do it for everyone? Why isn't God just healing people? And why, does this not happen? These stories are there to show who Jesus is, to point to his identity and authority. And so they're placed in different ways, and they tell different bits about who he is, the people he interacts with, the way he forgives sins before he heals in an encounter then that starts arguments with the Pharisees and things like that. There's a use to them in the narrative that is not just, hey, look, here's a miracle. And so we need to not see them in those terms. And we'll get a couple of miracle stories sort of here through this. But we start off chapter 7. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. So the nice little segue there. And here we get a healing story. And this one is a bit of a different one. It is the Centurion who sends people out to find Jesus on his behalf. And the Centurion is a Roman soldier who is pretty high up in charge of a century, which we would say is 100. In practicality, it was usually 60 to 80 soldiers that he was in charge of. So pretty wealthy, pretty established guy. He seems to be really well respected in the Jewish community, despite being a Gentile and despite being a Roman soldier, because people are willing to go on his behalf and sort of advocate for him. As a Gentile, it would have been rude of him to invite Jesus, a respected rabbi, into his home. It would have made Jesus unclean to have gone in. And so this guy seems to be aware of that. And he sends out an envoy to get Jesus. But he says, hey, look, you're great. I've heard a lot of things about you. I trust enough that you can just do this. You don't have to come to me. You don't have to do anything, but please just do this. And Jesus is really touched by this. And he heals the man's slave from afar. And so as soon as the envoy comes back, they come back to find the slave healed. And Jesus says, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. So again, reaching out and spreading the boundaries of what is the kingdom and what God is looking for in people. For the Pharisees, it was about what your lineage was, who your blood relations were, and it was about following the letters of the law. And here Jesus is meeting a Roman soldier and saying that he's found great faith. Then he moves on and went to a town called Nain, and he heals a woman's son. And there's a few layers to this. First, this is a really, really tragic event for a woman to outlive her son. She's on her own. Seemingly her husband has died, and without her son, she has no means to take care of herself unless she has other wealthy family, but it doesn't seem to be that the case here. And so this would have been incredibly tragic because she would have had nothing. She would have no way to take care of herself, no means of income, and nothing in that society. And so beyond just the tragedy of a mother losing her son, she's also losing any element of security and means to keep herself alive and afloat. And so it's incredibly tragic. The other elements are usually with a funeral procession, it was the height of rudeness to interrupt it at all. And so Jesus is really stepping out here to interrupt it. And normally you would just see a funeral procession and just kind of join in the back of it as it came. And Jesus comes straight to the front and stops and actually touches the woman's son. And that also is one of the most unclean things you can do, is to touch a dead body. And so normally to do that would have been reserved only for his really close family, who would have undergone that level of uncleanness to dress the body, to take care of it, and to bury it. And so Jesus comes up and touches it, but rather than be made unclean, the man is raised to life. And so this is one of the few times we hear about Jesus raising someone from the dead along with Lazarus. And there are a couple points in the Old Testament where someone is raised from the dead, but it's a pretty uncommon miracle and it's pretty astounding. And so that, coupled with the healing from afar, which is also quite an astounding miracle, these things are showing you who Jesus is, but it also shows his kindness. The people he's interacting with, a centurion, a Gentile, a Roman soldier, and then a widow who has just lost everything. These are people on the fringes. And we'll see another person on the fringes in a minute. This is almost like a sandwich here. But before we get to that other sandwich story, that last bookend, we have the story, and I'll go ahead and read this, beginning in verse 18. The disciples of John reported all these things to him. So John summoned 2 of his disciples and sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" So John is at this point wondering, what is Jesus doing? Am I sure that Jesus is who I thought he was, that Jesus is the Messiah? John is maybe a bit unsure here. When the men had come to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, are you the one who was to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus had just then cured many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to many who were blind. And he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." So again, this is Jesus himself telling us about how these miracles and these stories of miracles fit into who he is. It is about enacting this messianic era, this new age in which new things are happening. It's a sign of the times, if you will. It's not just that Jesus is completing quests and healing people, and there's a certain amount of people who need healing, and Jesus heals a certain percentage, and he's trying to get to 100%. No, it's about signs that show that this is the messianic age. And so John's a bit unsure if Jesus is the right person, if John had him pegged right. I don't know what John was expecting. Maybe John was expecting more of a military conqueror and more of a bombastic and strictly Jewish sort of character who would rally the Jewish faithful, the remnant of those who were the most faithful to the law, maybe, and lead them out into the wilderness, maybe like John himself. Whatever John's expecting, Jesus doesn't quite seem to meet it, but Jesus references some bits of scripture here that bits of the Old Testament that talk about what the Messiah would do. And so he says those things and sends them back. And then he has this little aside. When John's messengers had gone, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who put on fine clothing and live in luxury are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I tell you, more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare a way for you. I tell you, among those born of women, no one is greater than John, yet the least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. And there's a few references in there. Jesus says, what did you go out to see? A reed shaken by the wind. And at this stage, and again to Luke's readers, they know that John was arrested and imprisoned by Herod and Herod Antipas for John calling him out over his evil things that he was doing in his life and in his rule. And Herod has him arrested and then eventually beheaded. And that story is quite graphic and quite a salacious story. Herod Antipas's sort of logo, if you will, or was on his coins, was reeds. And it was a bunch of reeds. And so Jesus is probably referencing him here, knowing that even at this stage, John even could be in prison now, sending his disciples to Jesus from prison. But he says, what did you have to see? A reed shaken by the wind? In other words, another Herod Antipas type person. Did you go to see luxury, soft robes? Well, no, remember John was in camel hair and eating locusts and honey in the desert. He was out in the wilderness living rough. And that's partly why people went out to see him. And that Jesus here is confirming that he is the prophesied one to come before the Messiah. And all the people who heard this, including the tax collectors, acknowledged the justice of God because they had been baptized with John's baptism. But by refusing to be baptized by him, the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves. So Jesus is again in these conflicts with the Pharisees where he's saying, you went out to see John. John was great and John confirms me. But people like the Pharisees weren't getting baptized by John because they didn't think they needed it. They thought it was something beneath them or something for people who were less worthy of entering the kingdom than themselves. And then we have this interesting aside that I think is a really useful way to just frame things for ourselves. Jesus says in verse 31, to what then will I compare the people of this generation? And what are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another. We played the flute for you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not weep. And it was a fairly common game to play weddings, for kids to enact weddings in the streets or to do funerals. There was even a game that's attested later on in history called the Funeral of the Grasshopper, I think it is. So it actually is named. But this is games that kids were playing in the streets. But Jesus is referencing it, saying, this is like what's happening. And he says, for John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine. And you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking. And you say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Nevertheless, wisdom is vindicated by all her children. So Jesus is saying, again, to these characters, the Pharisee type people, the ones who are self-righteous and judgmental and who are putting other people down and making religion, taking it away from the heart of what it is. And he says, look, John was living in the desert, eating nothing but locusts and honey and wearing camel hair. And you didn't accept that. That wasn't good enough for you. And now I come and I'm just living among you, eating and drinking and doing normal things. And that you don't like either. So basically you can't, there's no pleasing you. You can't be pleased and you can't have it one way or the other, where either someone living an aesthetic lifestyle in the desert has a demon, or someone coming eating and drinking is also a glutton and a drunkard, and you can't have it both ways, Pharisees. The next story then is one that I think if we had more time, I would really love to unpack this fully, but maybe that's something for sermons or things like that in the future. And this is a really, again, an important story, but also a bookend story, like I mentioned earlier, in this sort of sandwich, where the first two stories of the Centurion and the widow are people on the margins. And this is also a person on the margins. Jesus is at a Pharisee's house eating. And it wasn't uncommon for someone in a big house to allow people to come in and out, especially if they considered themselves pious. They might allow poor people to come in and be fed or just be around their house. But if there was a dinner like this happening or something happening, Jesus and the Pharisee there, people could come in, but not participate in it. So you could come in and stay around the edges and maybe watch and listen if they were talking, if they were debating. So it's not that strange that she's there, though people are surprised that she has come up and sort of interrupted the meal. And Jesus is sitting there, and the woman comes up and uses her hair to bathe his feet with oil, and she's crying and she's kissing his feet. And everyone is pretty disgusted and repulsed at this, not just that she's touching his feet, but that she is known to be a sinner, and she has her hair down. So whatever this means, probably in just the context with the way that women are treated then and now, it's probably that she is seen to be someone who is maybe promiscuous or especially not married. She has her hair uncovered, and if she was married, she would have it covered up. But whatever it is that makes her seen to be a sinner, people are disgusted that Jesus is letting her do this. And Jesus uses it as a teaching point to say, basically, you've got a lot of privilege, Pharisee guy, and this woman does not. Yet she is here and she loves me, and he does not turn her away. He says that her sins are forgiven because she loves a lot. And there's a lot really in here about, again, who Jesus is interacting with, who he's welcoming, who he has harsh words for, and who he has kind words for. And he has harsh words for this religious leader who, even by all accounts, has neglected Jesus as a host. He hasn't offered him water to wash his feet. He hasn't anointed his head with oil. He hasn't actually treated him very well as a host, even though he is this pious Pharisee in this big house with all this money. And he's not even being a very good host, yet this woman who is known around town as a sinner is there with oil, and she is lavishing just love and gratitude towards Jesus. And Jesus tells her sins are forgiven. And again, just right in the face of these people. And again, bookending that story about John the Baptist. Is Jesus really the Messiah? Or they're nervous, or is he really the one? Because of who he's hanging out with, because he's hanging out with centurions, and he's healing centurion slaves, and he's raising widows' sons from the dead, and he's allowing sinner women to wash his feet and show him affection and gratitude. And these are not the kinds of people that they thought would make up the cream of the crop of this new kingdom that would be ushered in with the Messianic age. So this chapter is a really clear picture, clear little sandwich of Jesus defying expectations while at the same time fulfilling very clearly what was prophesied about the Messianic era. He is doing things differently than they expected, but not because he's breaking all the rules or not because he's doing it wrong. He's actually fulfilling everything that the scriptures said would be fulfilled, but he's still defying expectations. And I think that's a really, really interesting little sandwich there in chapter 7. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I hope that this had some nuggets that you found interesting. We'll be back next week, continuing on with Luke chapter 8. So thanks for joining us. Have a good evening.